Kirby Russia. Today we've got a real doozy for you. Very interesting, unusual topic. The topic of Russian-Pakistani relations, their history together through the Cold War, through the modern era, because we have a very, very strong guest today. Waqar Rizvi, who is the host of Scope on the Indus News TV network. He is going to be with us, and there is pretty much no one who speaks flawless English who knows as much about Pakistan and Pakistani relations with Russia as he does. So it's going to be really, really neat. I'm very excited for it, so stay tuned for that. But for now, let's hear my precious thoughts about this topic. Now, the way that Russia interacts with certain smaller countries, countries that make less news, can be very different from the way the United States does. Not to say in advance that's particularly better, but we have to say that's definitely different and with a bit less war. Now, a long time ago, there was this thing called the Seliger Youth Forum, which has since been broken up into smaller parts. It got too big for its own britches there. I spoke at that to a big audience of about a few thousand young people there. And I kind of talked about how it's unfortunate that in a lot of ways the Russian media ignores some of the big players on the earth. I mean, if you really look at what's on the Russian television, the Russian equivalents of Netflix or YouTube or whatever, there's definitely a lot of Russian stuff. That's there. That's different than, say, in Europe. I have some good friends in Hungary, and they basically said Hungarian television is American television, but translated. So there is Russian material, but mostly everything else is sort of Hollywood, the West. And when I say the West, I mean 95+% the United States and maybe a few French movies, right? So it's kind of talking about how awful it is that in a lot of ways there's countries that have had a good relationship with Russia, like India, for example, that, because they were sort of easy for the censors. A lot of Indian movies made it into the Soviet Union, actually, because there's just kind of dancing and singing and a simple love story, and the Soviet censors had no problem with that. But besides that, India really gets ignored by Russia. China gets spoken about in the news, but there has been some cooperation with new movies being made with the Chinese, but overall China kind of gets ignored in a media sense. And it's kind of sad, and that's what I gave the speech about. And so this Indian girl stood up, and like a lot of people, she sort of misunderstood what I said, or her feelings sort of jumped. She put the cart in front of the horse. She was like, well, how could you say that? How could you say that India is not important? We have 1 billion people. No. India is very important. The problem is that Russia tends to always look west when it looks outside itself. And so that's one thing that I can definitely see is a problem when Russia relates to smaller countries like Pakistan, is that a lot of those, especially the Russian elite, the Moscow elite, be they the business elite or the government elite, doesn't really appreciate people in Pakistan, India, or Africa. The difference is that they don't see them as inferior. So this is sort of the paradox here, whereas the Russians don't seem to really appreciate the value of Indians and this, that, and the other. One thing that they are better at, the United States, is they seem to be able to speak the language of the so-called global South. Especially even throughout the whole Cold War. The Soviet Union preached state atheism, but tend to get along very well rhetorically with all those Arabic nations and going east into Iran and so on. So the Muslim nations are able to get along with the atheist Soviet Union, because it seems like Russians are maybe a bit more culturally close in at least the way people interact and talk and do things to their neighbors to the south, southeast, more so than through Eastern Europe going to the west. So that's kind of one of these things where whenever we're thinking about Russia's relationship with some of these, countries that are smaller, hotter, that don't get mentioned very much, I think a lot of times the Russian, be they the diplomats, the businessmen, military guys, tend to be able to speak, not in a literal sense, the local language, like speaking, I don't know, Spanish, not in a literal sense, but speak the cultural language better than, say, the United States really ever could. The problem is Russia doesn't really back up those words with a ton of money and an amazing, well-worked-out ideology like the United States State Department can. But as you see, I think the real overall interesting dynamic is that Russia has the ability to speak to these countries, and yet really doesn't value it. I even used to work at a startup company. Okay, this company has zero connection to anything I do right now. And this startup company was able to make an interesting little program. It was a concept of what would eventually become sort of Telegram. If we would have made the right moves, we would have had Telegram, but we didn't. But anyways, the program started to take off in, I believe it was Malaysia. Okay, so what they really wanted, their mission was to kind of give the illusion that this was an American company making this program. This is an American startup, and it's going to take off across college campuses like Facebook did and explode all over the world. Right? That was the concept. Well, Malaysia kind of bit. I think Indonesia was a little bit interested, and I'll never forget that the Russian boss, the guy, the big boss, the Russian guy, he seemed disappointed by this. He didn't seem to care, or see the value in this. He was obsessed with this idea of getting these views from America and this interest in America. But I don't know. We made a product, and there's people in these countries who are using it and could. But then, by the way, Malaysia is not a population-wise a tiny place. Neither is Indonesia. There's plenty of people there, and so if we were able to become a hit in Southeast Asia, especially in all those very hot islands down there, that would at least be something. That could be money. Maybe that could even be sustainable money. Didn't care. Not the right kind of users. And I think that is a real problem that plagues Russia. This obsession with the West's approval and lack of appreciation for Malaysians, apparently. But that's enough Malaysia. Let's get into speaking about Pakistan with our guest, Waqar Rizvi. Okay, Waqar, let's start out with one of my absolute favorite topics of all time, public perception. So, in Pakistan, what is the public perception of Russia and the United States in relationship to their attitudes towards Pakistan?
I think that there's perception upon the when it comes to the United States is that there's been always this connection with the U.S. because especially ever since the U.S. got involved in Afghanistan, there's been always this pressure on Pakistan because of its perceived control over the Afghan Taliban, which I think is overstated many times in many people's eyes, at least in Pakistan. They always think that the U.S. Tries to have this blame game going. At the beginning, when it first got involved in Afghanistan, it was all praises to Pakistan because Pakistan gave it, overflight access, which it provided, till very recently, and still has extended that, in fact, even after the U.S. withdrawal. But then, when things started going south in Afghanistan, then the blame game began against Pakistan that, hey, Pakistan was muddying the water, so to speak. That's the first part. Now, on the Russian part, I think there's less, I'll be very honest with you, I think there's less people who think a lot about Russia in Pakistan, which is unfortunate. But I think that's recently changed ever since Foreign Minister Lavrov's recent visit to the country. This was after 9 years that we had a Russian official visit Pakistan. So I think it's back on the radar, right? I think there's an understanding, especially with this newer Pakistani government of Imran Khan, of more multipolarity and polarity order, world order. And so there's an understanding that Russia is also, of course, an important player. I think we've always known that, but we just didn't know how exactly and what exactly we could do with our relations with the Russians to improve our own stances. So I think that that's slowly coming up, but I would say that the lack of awareness is still probably an issue amongst the general population.
You just mentioned multipolarity. That is a very hot button word within Russia. So, are your politicians starting to use the terminology multipolarity, or should I say the multipolarity model, as it is a model for international relations? Is that hot in Pakistan right now?
All right. So yes, there is definitely an understanding on the part of the elite, the political establishment, that we are in a multipolar world. And so that's why we're recalibrating our relations with many others around the world, such as the Russians, because we realize that we don't want to be in just one axis, so to speak. So we don't want to be in a US axis. We have good relations with the Chinese now because of CPEC, BRI, et cetera. And so then the Russians sort of come along with that because we understand that China and Russia also have good relations and have mutual interests in many regards around the world. But I think it's a question of Pakistan finally then realizing that it needs to have independent policy making as well. And that then That then means having your own national interest centered and then having good relations, even if you don't get along about every single issue around the world with others, including the Russians, Chinese, etc.
Okay, let's go back to public perception. Now, the Cold War was a time of change for pretty much the entire world, but it was definitely years of change for Pakistan. I mean, there are still people alive today who lived during British India, but now both the British and the Indians, for you guys, are gone and are outside your borders. So, how did the Pakistanis view themselves during the context of this end of the colonial era, the whole Cold War thing? How did you view yourselves back then?
To be honest, I think the Russians, as in the USSR, if I may be more specific, the Soviet Union, had okay relations with Pakistan at certain points. So, for example, under the government of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the USSR helped us build our probably most important steel mill, the Pakistan steel mill, which I believe now the Russians, in fact, during this trip of Lavrov, have agreed to actually update for us because there's some issues that we're going through with that steel mill. And that's an extremely important industry for us, extremely important factor for us. So the Russians have had that influence over us even from the Soviet days, and that's been very vital. With the Americans, I think that there was that perception, as you know, about what happened with Afghanistan. And Afghanistan, I keep bringing that up because that's always been the prism through which many of the external countries have viewed Pakistan. We've always been used it as important strategically because of the fact that we are a neighboring country to Afghanistan, which I think is also unfortunate. I mean, we can talk about that later too, but I think that putting us just into that box is probably an unfortunate reality. We're more than just a neighbor of Afghanistan. So I think that the two countries sort of haggled over us, I wouldn't say is the right word, but as in we went back and forth because of the realities of what was happening in Afghanistan throughout these years. And like I said, I think that that's probably an unfair box to put us in. But nevertheless, that's, I think, what influenced our relations with both sides.
Okay, so what would the modern economic relationship between Russia and Pakistan look like? Is it a steel thing? Is it energy? Or did the 1990s pretty much kill every opportunity?
No, so I mean, with this current trip of Foreign Minister Lavrov, and now just, in fact, over the past 24 hours and 72 hours, in fact, I think there's been a deal which has been finalized, and it's been a long time coming. This was set in motion in 2015, which is a gas pipeline that the Russians are meant to help us build between the cities of Karachi, which is a southern port city in Pakistan, and Lahore, so where I'm sitting right now in Punjab province. So it won't just be serving Lahore, but it'll also be serving other cities, important areas within the Punjab province. A $2.25 billion project. The Russians will have, I think, and I know this is up for debate right now, but I think around a 26% stake once this project is done, and the Pakistanis will have around 74%. So nevertheless, I mean, the Russian know-how, the Russian infrastructure, the Russian construction will be helping us a lot in this regard, and that's huge for us. As I said, for countries that didn't even have very high profile visits back and forth over the past 9 years or so, this is really a significant leap forward in our relations in that regard. And as I mentioned, the steel mill probably being updated fairly soon is on the cards, and there are military equipment sales that are set to happen fairly soon. At this point, I mean, I look for details, I didn't find any. It's unspecified right now, but there was talk of that during the Lavrov trip. And then there's a few military drills coming up as well fairly soon, in which the Pakistanis will be taking part along with the Russians.
Okay, so firstly, Waqar, I have to beg your forgiveness because I know my Cleveland accent does not exactly sound flattering when talking about countries like Afghanistan and Pakistan. Sorry. So, the Soviets and the Americans had conflicts in Afghanistan. The Americans have invaded Iraq twice. Iran is always under constant threat. Syria is in flames to this day. So it's almost like you guys in Pakistan are on the very edge of the iron sights of American foreign policy. Does this positioning have any effect on politics in Pakistan? I mean, aren't you guys afraid of becoming next?
I don't think we're afraid of becoming next, but I think that what this does is, as I said, it always makes us, in the eyes of the Americans at least, a conduit. We're just there, and we're just to be used as this passageway to get things done for them because of our strategic location, and we're seen less for our potentials domestically, economically and otherwise, of course. So I think that that's unfortunate. But yes, I mean, the relations with Iran are are challenging for us as well, because, as you know, there was a gas pipeline deal that just unfortunately didn't actually then work out from the Pakistani side because we were afraid of sanctions, and those sanctions threats were very, very real. As with, in fact, interestingly, even with this pipeline I mentioned before, the name was changed from, I think it was North-South gas pipeline, to a very Pakistani name called the Pakistani Stream, or Pakistan Stream gas pipeline. And that was, again, done to avoid U.S. sanctions. As you know, there was a U.S. sanctions threat even on Nord Stream 2. So the Americans are very touchy about energy as well around the world, where they can have influence. So I think that, yes, beyond, of course, just Iran, Afghanistan, as I've already mentioned, we're in a tough neighborhood, certainly, and we have a lot of people who try to control our policy making, and some of them have been successful because of our economic situation, because of the fact that we've had challenges over the years politically as well, instability in that regard. So there have been countries in the Middle East, for example, who have tried to take advantage of us. But I think that with this latest, more stable political situation, if I may use that phrase, we are then able to now start recalibrating, hopefully, and become more balanced. And I don't know if the word is neutral, but just more balanced, probably, in how we approach everybody.
Now, who are these people that you mentioned that want to control Pakistani policy, and to what end?
The goal is multifaceted, probably. So we, as I said, because we do have, and we have had a lot of political instability, and then by default, then economic instability, as you know, that those two are always intertwined, we've then had to export a lot of labor. So as we know, that a lot of those laborers and the money that they would send back, or the remittances that they would send back to the country, became then a part of our economy, because that was very vital. A lot of them were being able to, support families back here in Pakistan while working as a construction worker and or domestic servant of some sort to a lot of these Persian Gulf countries, within these Persian Gulf countries. Now, I think that because of that, then, because these countries knew that we were in a dire economic situation, that whenever a country gives you a quote unquote gift of money, it's not without strings attached. You always have strings attached. You need a favor back from that country. So Pakistan was then always put in an awkward situation when the likes of the Saudis or somebody else within the Middle East would give them money to pay off a certain loan or debt to an international lender. That would again come with strings attached, and that created a whole bunch of reverberations within the country, and we can probably talk about them in great detail. But that then became the prison through which they saw us, and then they sought to try to control us. I think that we're slowly coming out of that now, because I think as we know, there are alliances are quickly changing around the world, and so I think even Pakistan is part of that change.
As these alliances are changing before our eyes, how do the big players around the globe see you today?
Well, the narrative always is that we are a bunch of terrorists waiting to attack somebody. We're a bunch of extremists in some way. We are, we are very patriarchal. We're very conservative, all of us. I mean, it's this huge generalization of all Pakistanis. And, Pakistanis, as in with any country around the world, any nation around the world, we're extremely diverse. So yes, we have our significant amount of people who are extremely conservative religiously as well, but we also have the opposite. We're extremely liberal, extremely Western leaning. So we have that variety. So I think there's always that nuance which is missing when it comes to discussing Pakistan. And so it's very unfair. I think that when we have a lot of those international correspondents for international news agencies and international organizations based, for example, in Islamabad, and they, from their little bubbles in Islamabad, are able to then pass huge judgments on us, again, from their prism, right, from what they've been told by the respective organizations to keep going as far as the narrative goes. Now, on the other side, yes, Pakistanis are, as with anybody else around the world, we are worried about things like our economy, getting by on a daily basis, and other things that Pakistanis do worry about, yes, is Kashmir. I mean, the government pushes that line as well, but many Pakistanis do care about the issue of Kashmir being unresolved still. And beyond that, I mean, there are significant issues within the country. Pakistanis have significant grievances with their, political establishment. But again, all of that has to be viewed with a nuance, right? It has to be viewed with the context of what people are going through here. So, for example, energy needs. Electricity is extremely important. It's gotten a lot better in these years, but it's still a significant issue where if you don't have electricity most of the day or a lot of the day, that then hurts businesses, that hurts an investment climate, that hurts education. All of the above is extremely important. We also need investment to be spread out throughout the country and not just in the urban centers. Again, not an issue which is unique to Pakistan, but I mean, these are sort of global issues in many ways, but there's also this very domestic context. And these things are not, unfortunately, spoken of, sometimes even by domestic media properly, but international media certainly.
So the question is, who should be investing in Pakistan? Are you talking about, your local millionaires and billionaires, or are you speaking about big international corporations who pretty much only see value in big cities and definitely don't see any value in local labor?
Both of the above. So, I mean, we have, yes, issues with corruption. So we need that money to stay within the country, not just escape the country, where if you're making millions off of the country, you don't just escape with that money somewhere else, invest somewhere else, try to buy citizenship somewhere else. That's been an issue for a very, very long time in Pakistan. On the part of those who are the elite and the rich, and secondly, yes, we need foreign investment certainly, but we need that done on a basis which I think this government has been better about. It's been better about signing deals with other countries, not on the basis of the fact that, hey, we have to agree about everything or that you're going to be our benefactor, but we're going to be equal partners in this regard. So, or as equal as possible. So we'll use your know-how, but we also want to benefit for the country. Because in the past we've had, and many people would argue that we still have some deals in place where foreigners come in, they invest, but then they only employ their own people from their own respective countries. So then you're not even giving employment to Pakistanis to a very large extent, or you're only using us as laborers. So A, we're not getting the know-how, and B, the money that is being made, technically, a lot of it is then leaving the country back to your own respective country. So, it's just a bad deal for us overall sometimes.
Okay, so geopolitically, to the west, Pakistan has a big hot zone of conflict. But to the east, it sort of has its own Cold War going on with India. So how do the actions of America and Russia affect India, which in turn affects you?
Well, both the Russians and the Americans have good relations with the Indians, and they have for many, many years. But at the same time, I think that under especially the current Prime Minister Modi, I think that the Indian tilt has been more towards the Americans, if we're completely honest, especially during the Trump tenure, but even after that. And there are some very obvious reasons for that. I mean, admittedly, India is a much larger economy. It's a much larger population than we are, several times over. And that's obviously a reality. And I think Pakistanis very much understand that. Even, conversations I've had with Pakistani officials are that it's not that we're expecting the world to not have relations with India. It's just that, we want more balanced relations with us as well. So that's one thing, actually, I believe that is a challenge, even in our relations with Russia, because Russia has, for example, on things like Article 370, when it came to the Kashmir region, at the time that the Indians abrogated that article, which had given autonomous status to that region, the Russians sort of said at that time that this is an internal Indian matter and we don't want to get involved. And the Pakistanis, I believe, would not have been very happy about that, even though they probably didn't say so very much publicly. But in and of itself, I think that's fine. I don't think the Pakistanis are expecting all of our allies, friends, or those who we have partnerships with to agree with everything we want them to agree with. It doesn't work like that. Global diplomacy doesn't work like that. So there is this much more mature understanding than of global politics that, hey, we may not agree with the Russians when it comes to India, but that's fine. We can still work with them. As long as they have balanced relations with us and we're able to have a mutually beneficial relationship.
All right, guys, so I hope you enjoyed another episode of Tim Kirby Russia, especially talking about Pakistan, which is a nice topic that gets way too ignored, both in the West and in Russia itself. But anyways, guys, I need your support. If you guys can't share this program around, the algorithms are against us. The system is against us. If you want this type of information to get out there, you're going to have to share it yourselves. I would really appreciate it if you would share this video and subscribe to any service where you found this. Thank you very much. We'll have the full interview with Waqar Rizvi coming up very, very soon. So stay tuned for that. There are a couple secrets that didn't make it into this episode.